I want to ask you a question before I tell you anything else, because I think the question matters more than the answer I'm about to give you. When Washington escalates a war it keeps saying is basically won, when it threatens a blockade one day and strikes 80 targets the next, who exactly is making that call? I don't think it's who you assume. I've spent a career around rooms where decisions like this actually get made. And I think what happened this week only makes sense once you stop asking, what does America want here? And start asking a different question entirely. What does Israel need from America right now? And is Washington actually in a position to say no to it? Because here's the sequence. A ceasefire that was signed with real signatures in mid-June. Talks in Doha that Iranian and American negotiators both described as making progress as recently as the 1st of this month. And then within days, tankers struck in the Strait, American strikes on more than 80 targets, a blockade threatened from a NATO podium, and a sitting president calling the very government his own negotiators were sitting across the table from scum, cuckoo, sick people. That's not the behavior of a government executing its own considered strategy. That's the behavior of a government being pulled along by someone else's timeline. And I think if you go back through this entire war, from the opening strikes in February straight through to tonight, you'll notice a pattern that I don't think is a coincidence anymore. Israel moves first, or signals it's about to. Washington then finds itself explaining after the fact why it had no choice but to follow. That's not an alliance functioning the way an alliance is supposed to function, with one senior partner setting the pace. That's a junior partner setting the pace and a senior partner scrambling to keep up with decisions it didn't actually make. I don't say that lightly, and I don't say it as some kind of accusation floated for shock value. I say it because if you don't start from that premise, nothing else that's happened this week actually makes sense. Not the timing, not the rhetoric, not the willingness to blow up a memorandum that took months to negotiate over what amounts to a dispute about 3 tankers. Once you accept that Washington is reacting to someone else's clock rather than running its own, the entire week suddenly reads differently. It stops looking like American strategy and starts looking like American improvisation dressed up afterward as a plan. So that's where I want to start tonight, not with the strikes themselves, with the question of who's actually deciding when they happen. And I think there's a specific piece of reporting from earlier this year that people have already forgotten, but that I think explains more about this war's actual structure than almost anything said publicly since. Israel had reportedly planned to strike Iran without even fully briefing Washington beforehand, not coordinating, not seeking approval, informing after the fact or barely before it. And when that plan moved forward anyway, Washington found itself explaining retroactively that it had been forced into supporting a strike it hadn't actually originated. I don't think that's a minor procedural detail. I think that's the entire relationship in miniature. The senior partner in this alliance is supposed to set the terms under which force gets used. Here, the terms got set elsewhere, and Washington's job became explaining the decision after it had already been made. And once you see that pattern once, you start seeing it everywhere in this conflict. The initial strikes back in February came after Israeli lobbying specifically for a joint operation targeting Iran's leadership directly, not just its programs. The pace of escalation since then has consistently tracked Israeli operational timelines in Gaza and Lebanon, at least as closely as it's tracked anything resembling an independent American strategic calculation. And now this week, we're watching American negotiators in Doha describe progress on a deal while strikes proceed on a schedule that doesn't appear to be waiting for that diplomacy to conclude either way. And I keep coming back to the same question. If Washington were actually the one driving this, wouldn't the timing at least occasionally favor the diplomats instead of the bombs? It never does. Not once across 5 months now. And I think that consistency, that unbroken pattern of the bombs winning the timing argument every single time, is itself the strongest evidence available that this isn't Washington's war to end, even though it's Washington's name attached to it and Washington's soldiers positioned to absorb whatever comes next. There's also the alliance costs nobody in Washington wants to add up honestly. NATO members who saw no legal basis for joining a war framed as counterproliferation, but conducted as regime decapitation. An alliance that increasingly looks less like a unified structure and more like a name attached to a series of bilateral relationships, each partner quietly deciding independently how much of this particular war it actually wants any part of. I don't think NATO collapses in some dramatic single moment because of this. I think it just stops functioning as the thing it was supposed to be, slowly, exactly the way it's been stopping this year. One summit, one refused request, one unilateral Israeli decision at a time. Now, let me correct something that I think almost everyone covering this war has gotten backward. And I think getting it backward is exactly why Washington keeps making the same mistake over and over. The dominant story, the one you've heard on repeat for months now, is that Iran is on its back foot. Weakened leadership, a dead supreme leader, a battered military, a population exhausted by war and economic pressure. And I understand why that story is comforting to tell, but I don't think it's true. And I think believing it is actively dangerous because it leads decision makers in Washington to keep pushing on a door they think is about to give way, when it isn't giving way at all. Here's what I mean. Iran absorbed the initial wave of strikes back in February, the decapitation strikes, the destroyed warships, the killing of its supreme leader, and came out the other side with something like 90% of its military infrastructure still standing. Think about that number for a second. 90%. That's not a country that got dismantled. That's a country that got hit hard and mostly held its structure together anyway. And in the lull that followed, while everyone in Washington was celebrating what they called a decisive victory, Iran was quietly bringing in advanced radar systems and long-range anti-ship missiles from partners who have every interest in seeing this war drag on. Technicians included on the ground doing the integration work in real time. And then there's the thing nobody in Washington seems to want to reckon with, which is what happened politically inside Iran after Qam was killed. The assumption going in was that removing him would fracture the regime, create an opening, maybe even trigger the kind of collapse from within that decapitation strikes are supposed to produce. Instead, from what I can see, support for him and by extension for the government he led tend to unify populations rather than divide them, especially populations that already see the outside world as an existential threat rather than a neutral observer. So when Washington keeps describing this as a war it's winning, I think what's actually happening is closer to the opposite. The side that's supposed to be collapsing keeps getting stronger, more integrated with outside military technology, more politically unified at home. And the side that's supposed to be winning keeps needing new justifications for why the win hasn't actually arrived yet. That gap between the story being told and the trend actually underway is exactly the kind of gap that gets people killed, because policy built on a false premise doesn't correct itself. It just escalates, looking for the moment when reality finally matches the story, and that moment keeps not arriving. Go back to the opening days of this war for a second, because I think what happened then still shapes everything happening now, even if nobody talks about it directly anymore. Israel struck first, catching Iran genuinely off guard, something close to what people described at the time as a Pearl Harbor moment. And the expectation openly stated was that Iran would need days, maybe longer, to organize any kind of coherent response. Instead, within about 18 hours, Iran was firing hundreds of ballistic missiles back, including hypersonic systems, directly into Tel Aviv and across Israeli territory. Israel's own missile defense system, the one built specifically to prevent exactly that scenario, failed to intercept everything it needed to intercept. Israeli intelligence, which was supposed to have anticipated the scale of that response, didn't. And within days, it was Netanyahu asking Washington to intervene directly with American military power to keep his own military campaign from collapsing under a response he had encouraged Washington to help provoke in the first place. I think that sequence tells you something that the current victory narrative conveniently leaves out. This wasn't a case of overwhelming American and Israeli force meeting a country that folded quickly. It was a case of overwhelming force meeting resistance nobody adequately planned for, followed by the country that started the war needing rescue from the very ally it had asked to help it start that war. That's not the story of a winning campaign requiring occasional mop-up strikes. That's the story of a campaign that came close to spiraling out of the initiating side's control within its first 18 hours and has needed continuous escalation ever since, just to avoid admitting that. I think this is worth sitting with for a second because it reframes everything else in this war. If Iran genuinely emerged from the opening strikes intact and increasingly reinforced, then every subsequent round of escalation, every new wave of strikes, every blockade threat isn't closing out a winning campaign. It's a government doubling down on a bet that hasn't paid off yet, hoping the next round is the one that finally does. And I think that's a pattern worth naming plainly because it isn't unique to this particular war. It's the same pattern that's played out across roughly 2 decades of American military engagement across this region, a pattern where the promised decisive turning point keeps getting announced publicly and keeps failing to arrive privately. And the response each time isn't to question the underlying premise, it's to escalate further in pursuit of a turning point that the premise itself never actually supported in the first place. Now, I want to talk about something that I think gets flattened every time this war gets described as 2 governments fighting each other, because it isn't that. It's 2 governments with completely different stakes fighting for completely different things. And that asymmetry is the single most important fact in this entire conflict. Washington and Israel are fighting this war to win, to establish dominance, to remove a perceived threat, to reshape the regional order in their favor. That's a war fought for position, for advantage, for what amounts to regional primacy. Iran is fighting this war to survive as a state, as a government, as a civilization that sees itself, rightly or wrongly, as facing an existential campaign of destruction rather than a limited military operation. And I think that distinction changes everything about how long each side is willing to keep fighting and what each side is willing to sacrifice to keep fighting. A country fighting to win can stop when the cost outweighs the benefit. There's a rational calculation available to it, a point where continuing simply isn't worth it anymore. And leadership can make that call without threatening its own survival. A country fighting to survive doesn't have that option. There's no rational stopping point when the alternative to fighting is perceived annihilation. You don't negotiate a ceasefire with an existential threat. You outlast it, however long that takes, however much it costs, because the alternative isn't a worse outcome, it's no outcome at all. And I think that's exactly why Iran keeps absorbing devastating strikes and coming back, rather than folding the way a rational cost-benefit calculation would predict. It's not stubbornness. It's not fanaticism. Whatever the easy explanation on cable news wants you to believe, it's a government and a population that have concluded correctly or not that this war is existential. And existential wars don't end through exhaustion. They end through resolution, one way or the other, or they simply don't end. And this is where Gaza and the West Bank stop being a separate story and become the actual center of this one, because Iran isn't going to accept peace terms with Israel while Israeli operations continue there, expanding, killing, displacing at the scale that's being documented for months now. From Tehran's perspective, and I think you have to actually understand a perspective to predict what a government will do next. Agreeing to peace while that continues isn't peace. It's surrender to an ongoing campaign they believe is aimed eventually at them, too. So every time Washington asks why Iran won't simply accept a deal that looks generous on paper, the honest answer is that the deal doesn't actually address the thing Iran considers the real threat. It addresses nuclear enrichment and missile ranges. It doesn't touch Gaza and doesn't touch the West Bank. And until it does, from where Tehran sits, nothing on offer actually ends the war it believes it's fighting. I think that's the piece almost nobody wants to say plainly, because it complicates a story that's easier to tell as a simple nuclear dispute. But wars end when both sides agree on what the war was actually about. And right now, Washington and Tehran aren't even fighting the same war in their own heads. One side is fighting to stop a bomb. The other is fighting to stop an existential campaign it believes started decades ago and hasn't stopped since. And I think you have to go back further than most people are willing to actually understand why Iran sees it that way rather than dismissing it as propaganda. For decades, the United States has ran base could be placed from which Iran could be threatened or watched. From Tehran's perspective, that's not defensive posture. That's containment with a trigger attached. And the old order that used to define this entire region, the borders drawn after the First World War, carved up at Versailles by outside powers, deciding for local populations how their countries would be shaped. That old order is the thing Iran believes it's actually fighting against now, not just a nuclear inspection regime or a missile range limit. When you hear Iranian officials talk about sovereignty, about refusing outside dictation, I don't think that's just rhetoric for a domestic audience. I think it's a genuinely held position that the entire post-war architecture of this region was imposed from outside, and that this war is, in their telling, one more chapter of the same imposition, just with precision munitions instead of colonial mandates. So when Washington asks, genuinely puzzled, why Iran won't simply accept a deal and step back, I think the honest answer is that Iran isn't just being asked to give up centrifuges. It's being asked in its own understanding of the stakes to accept the regional order it has spent decades trying to escape, one more time, under military pressure instead of diplomatic negotiation. That's a much harder thing to accept than a technical arms control provision. And it's why I don't think this ends the way Washington keeps assuming it will, through exhaustion and eventual capitulation. All right, let me bring this back home, because I don't think most people watching this have connected what's happening in the Gulf to what's happening in their own bank account yet. And I think that connection is coming faster than anyone in Washington wants to admit. Start with the debt. The United States is sitting on something north of $37 trillion in national debt. And that figure doesn't even include the agency debt that rarely gets mentioned in the same breath. Every additional week of this war, every additional strike package, every additional carrier group repositioned to the Gulf adds to that number quietly, without a single vote in Congress specifically authorizing it as war spending. I think people assume wars get paid for through some visible budget process. They don't. They get paid for through the debt ceiling getting raised a little further every time nobody's looking closely enough to object. Then there's the missiles themselves. And this is the part that should actually worry any taxpayer paying attention. Iranian drones cost around $20,000 a piece to build. American interceptors, the missiles used to shoot them down, run close to $4 million each. Do that math across a sustained campaign. Thousands of drones against a limited interceptor stockpile. And you start to understand why sustained aerial war against a country the size of Europe with mobile dispersed missile batteries isn't a war of technology superiority. It's a war of arithmetic. And the arithmetic doesn't favor the side spending $4 million to stop something built for $20,000. Then there's gold. And I think this is a signal most people are missing entirely because it doesn't show up on the evening news the way an explosion does. Every time confidence in the dollar wavers, every time a war like this drags on with no clean resolution in sight, capital looks for somewhere else to sit. And it's been sitting increasingly in gold with what looks like no real ceiling on how high that goes as this war continues to grind on without a decisive end. And then underneath all of it, there's the mechanism that ties the whole thing together, the one geographic choke point that turns an abstract war on the other side of the world into something you feel directly at the pump. Kar Island, where roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports move through a single terminal. One serious strike there or on the Bandar Abbas terminals nearby, and Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz in response. And that single stretch of water carries something like 20% of the entire world's oil supply. Close it even partially, even for a matter of weeks, and you're not looking at a regional inconvenience. You're looking at $7 gasoline, disrupted supply chains, truckers who can't move freight, an economy that doesn't need a single American casualty to feel the cost of a war fought on the other side of the planet. So when I add all of that up, the debt, the missile arithmetic, the gold, the Hormuz exposure, I don't think this is a war with a contained cost sitting somewhere in a defense budget line item. I think it's a war whose actual bill is going to land on ordinary people who never got a vote on whether it should have started in the first place. And there's one more piece of exposure that almost never gets mentioned alongside the financial numbers, which is the physical exposure of American personnel sitting in the middle of all of it. There are something like 40,000 American troops spread across the Gulf in the UAE, in Qatar, across bases that were placed there again as part of that decades-long containment posture around Iran. If this war escalates the way the current trajectory suggests it might, those troops aren't positioned somewhere safely removed from the consequences. They're sitting directly inside the blast radius of exactly the kind of retaliatory strikes Iran has both the capability and I think the willingness to launch if push comes to shove. And it's not just military infrastructure at risk either. Retaliatory strikes aimed at oil facilities on the western side of the Gulf could just as easily hit the desalination plants that entire cities depend on for drinking water. Cities like Riyadh that have no meaningful backup water supply if those plants go offline. I don't think people fully appreciate that a war fought over oil and missiles could end up being decided in practice by whether millions of people in a major Gulf capital still have water coming out of their taps. So let me tell you what I think Washington should actually do, because I don't think it's enough to just describe the problem and walk away from it. I think you have to say plainly what the alternative looks like, even knowing nobody currently in power is likely to take it. First, an immediate ceasefire, genuinely bilateral, not one built on a funeral calendar that collapses the moment something else goes wrong. And alongside it, a clear public statement that Washington opposes the destruction of Iran, of Israel, or of any other state in this region, not as a gesture, but as an actual constraint on what happens next. I'd start that process with an emergency session at the United Nations Security Council. Not because the Security Council has covered itself in glory throughout this war, it hasn't, but because the alternative, letting this continue to escalate, one unilateral strike at a time, with no forum where the major powers are even forced, lasts 11 days before collapsing the way this one just did. Third, bring in the other major powers who actually have leverage here precisely because Washington increasingly doesn't. Russia, China, India, and Brazil sitting at the same table as the United States, arbitrating a settlement between Israel, Iran, and Iran's neighbors, rather than Washington trying to dictate terms to a country it can no longer intimidate into submission through airstrikes alone. And I'd note, because I think it matters, that those same powers are already involved on the ground in this conflict, whether Washington formally acknowledges it or not, supplying equipment, technical assistance, and diplomatic cover to Tehran throughout this war. Pretending they're not stakeholders doesn't make that less true. It just means Washington keeps negotiating as though it's the only power in the room, when increasingly it isn't.